Hello friends, welcome to Prophecy Files Briefing. We're glad that you've joined us. I want you to share this out and let other people hear and see the information that I believe is going to be valuable to you today. Just a few days ago, my good friend and veteran IDF soldier, ELLIOT CHODOFF, was in service with us and shared some information that was on the ground in Israel concerning what's taking place there, the future, and all of the happenings that are there. And of course, in recent days, we've seen bus bombings and so forth in Israel that is continuing to stir up and ratchet up what now is a very fragile ceasefire. So I want to take you into a few excerpts from ELLIOT CHODOFF right here at Pace Assembly.
So with that, October 7th happens. That's the bad news. The good news, also very Israeli, is that the turnaround begins that morning. Partly at the upper end of the system, more the political than the military. The military is still kind of in shock. And at the bottom end of the military system, and I want to start with them. Because Israel in that sense is a kind of crazy country. Since we serve as regulars and reservists, we're also intimately aware of why we're serving. And I'll just give you one example. I've trained with and I have trained U.S. military officers now for over 2 decades. And in sitting and talking, something that often comes up and it's germane to this. And I tell them, and I say this not in any way critical, as a matter of fact, I say it to the benefit of the United States. Your enemies, for the most part, are 10,000 miles from here. For the most part, right? When America, and this is not in favor, it was a good idea or a bad idea, America pulls out of Afghanistan, it leaves a mess 10,000 miles away. I don't live on the border with Lebanon, I live a little bit back. Now you got to realize, Israel's a huge country, it's about the size of New Jersey. It's tiny. And I live north of Haifa, for those who are familiar with the map, which means that when our forces blow up Hezbollah arsenals and munitions depots, which has been happening now for the past number of months, in Lebanon, we hear the explosions in my community. And very, very quickly, the security services send us WhatsApps. It's okay, it's our guys blowing up their stuff. Because, it doesn't have to be. I served for about a decade in Northern Command, the command that's responsible for the North, and I just want to give you an illustration of the difference from a military point of view of the 10,000-mile difference and us. In my office, in Northern Command headquarters, I had a floor-to-ceiling, wall-to-wall tactical map. For those who are familiar with maps, a 1 to 50,000 scale map, which I think is one of the most ingenious inventions ever put out there. For those who aren't familiar, it means that this is a kilometer. And what I'm about to show you is absolutely accurate, not exaggeration. On that map, over here is Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. Over here is Damascus, the capital of Syria. And over here is a dot, that's my house. It's kind of sobering to be in your headquarters and have your house on the tactical map. That's something that American forces haven't done for well over a century and a half. There was that civil war you had. Okay? And it's sobering. One of the consequences of all of that is you don't wait. So people immediately, reservists who hadn't been called up and regulars who hadn't been given orders, immediately began moving toward the battle zone. It was chaotic. Some of them, unfortunately, were killed in ambushes because there was no plan. It was run to the sound of the guns. The system wasn't quite up to it yet. The people on the ground were fighting desperately. But the system was trying to get a picture and it couldn't. In part also because the divisional headquarters down there was overrun by terrorists. I'll give you just one story to illustrate the Israeli method. There was an airborne company that was in not north of Israel, but north center of Israel. The company commander realized something was going on. His men had not been sent home for the weekend, as many had been, because it was Shabbat and holiday. And he doesn't have vehicles to get his men down to the fighting zone. So he gets in contact with the Air Force, and he says, send me a couple of helicopters. And they say, well, we don't have the orders to send helicopters. It's got to be coordinated. So he picks up the phone and he calls a friend of his who's a helicopter pilot. And he says, listen, I got to get down to Gaza with my guys. Can you bring me a helicopter? He says, yeah, I can do that. Now, under any other circumstances, they both would have been court-martialed. It's called stealing a helicopter. All right, stealing is such an ugly word. Borrowing a helicopter without authority. Commandeering, whatever. And that's how he gets his company down there and they get into the battle. So as horrible as what happened that day was, it could have been much, much, much worse had there not been an almost immediate response, again, on the ground level. And that's Israel. On the upper echelon level, a number of things happened as well. First and foremost, by mid-morning, the government declared we're at war. Now, that seems kind of trivial, but it's not. First of all, declaring that you're at war, and Israel's not the United States. It doesn't require, there's no congressional equivalent. There's a parliament, but it's a different system. It doesn't require a congressional declaration of war. The government, the executive, can declare it. But that has economic ramifications, it has military ramifications, it has social ramifications, and they're not so ready to do it. In 2006, we fought a war with Hezbollah during the summer in July and August, 34 days. I was in that one too. The government declared that a war in March 2007. All right, I'm going to say that again in case you weren't following. We fought it in July, August 06, and they declared it a war in March 07. Which meant that I was able to get a ribbon, which is somewhere in my office. Okay. So here, doing it already on the morning of the 7th was a huge step. The country had been racked by political divisions, and I won't go into that, the judicial reform, opponents, loud, raucous demonstrations against the government, including calls for non-response to reserve call-up. In other words, people should refuse to appear for reserve duty. And here I'm going to say something carefully but precisely. Those calls not to come to reserve duty did not cause October 7th, but it was one of the calculations in the design by Hamas to do what they did. Okay? In other words, to point to it and say that's why it happened is incorrect. But it was part of the mix. And usually, you know, it's true for all of us. When you make a decision, it's usually not for one reason. It's usually a conglomerate that come together. But they were reasonably certain, as was Hezbollah, and I'll talk about them in a bit, that an attack on Israel under those circumstances would be met with some level of paralysis as the opposition stood against and so on. That morning, the same morning, October 7th, the leaders of the demonstrations got on the radio, got on TV, and said, demonstrations are over. If you get called up, you go. It was over that quickly. And already that day, but primarily the next day, the largest reserve call-up numerically in Israel's history went into effect. 400,000 reservists were mobilized in the fastest call-up in Israel's history. In other words, from the call to full mobilization, took less than 3 days. 400,000 reservists. And suddenly, roughly half and half, I can't go into specific numbers, but for our purposes, good enough. The northern border has 200,000 troops. The southern border with Gaza has 200,000 troops. And the picture by Monday is very, very, very different from what it had been on Saturday. The consequence of all of this is that first and foremost, of the 6,000 terrorists who entered Israel from Gaza on October 7th, by midday October 8th, were all dead.